I never thought I'd hear those words from my own son. "You're just a burden, Mom." The Thanksgiving table fell silent, forks frozen midair, faces paralyzed in shock. My grandchildren's eyes widened, darting between their father and me. But Robert didn't flinch, didn't lower his voice, didn't show a hint of regret as he continued. "We're always having to check on you, drive you places, worry about your bills. When are you going to start thinking about how this affects us?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 40 years I'd spent building a life, sacrificing everything for my children. 40 years of careful planning, silent victories, and a secret that would have changed everything had he known. As tears threatened to fall, I simply placed my napkin beside my half-eaten turkey, thanked Vanessa for the lovely meal, and walked out into the cold November air. What my son didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in my modest handbag rested bank statements totaling 8 figures. The burden they resented so much was sitting on a fortune that could have changed their lives in an instant. But I didn't say a word. Sometimes silence speaks louder than money ever could. I never planned to keep secrets from my children. The fortune accumulated slowly, quietly, like snow gathering on a rooftop until its weight becomes impossible to ignore. My late husband Frank and I started with nothing, just 2 young people with ambition and the willingness to work harder than everyone else. We lived in a tiny apartment in downtown Portland when we first married. Frank worked at the shipyard, while I took night classes in finance, pregnant with Robert and sick most mornings. People thought we were crazy when I developed a more efficient inventory tracking system for Frank's company, a small innovation that led to a patent that quietly generated royalties for decades. We invested everything, lived beneath our means, and watched our savings grow. When Frank died 15 years ago from a sudden heart attack, Robert was already establishing himself in marketing. Jennifer had just married Paul and moved to Minnesota. I was alone with a financial portfolio that had far exceeded anything Frank and I had dreamed possible. "Mom, you should sell this old house," Robert said at the funeral reception, gesturing around our modest ranch-style home. "It's too much for you to manage alone." "I like this house," I replied simply. "Your father and I raised you here." What I didn't mention was that the mortgage had been paid off for 12 years, or that I owned 3 other properties outright, including a beautiful beachfront cottage in Cannon Beach that no one in the family knew about. My little consulting work, after retirement, actually involved sitting on the boards of 3 companies and managing my own investment portfolio. The first real warning signs appeared 3 years ago. Robert had always been ambitious, competitive, just like his father. But somewhere along the way, the warmth had leached out of him, replaced by a brittle kind of pride. "Mom, we're redoing our kitchen," he announced during a Sunday visit. "Top of the line everything. Vanessa has an amazing eye for design." "That sounds expensive," I commented mildly. His expression tightened. "Well, some of us are doing very well for ourselves." I noticed how he emphasized "some of us," as though placing me firmly in another category. I could have mentioned that my investment in a tech startup had just tripled in value, or that my financial advisor had called that very morning to discuss diversifying some assets. Instead, I just smiled and asked to see the design plans. Later that day, I overheard Robert speaking to Vanessa in the kitchen. "Did you see her sweater? Same one she's had for years. I don't understand why she lives like this when we could help her." "Your mother is very independent," Vanessa replied, her voice lowered. "Maybe she's comfortable. Or maybe she's just being stubborn. She's getting older. She should be thinking about assisted living, not rattling around in this old house. We can't keep checking on her forever." I quietly stepped away, my heart heavy. The assumption in his voice was clear. His aging mother was becoming a liability, a responsibility he hadn't planned for. The visits grew less frequent after that. Robert would call instead, his questions perfunctory. How was I feeling? Was I taking my medications? Had I considered that retirement community he'd mentioned? Each conversation felt less like caring and more like checking a box. Meanwhile, my portfolio continued to grow. George Mitchell, my financial advisor and Frank's oldest friend, would shake his head during our quarterly meetings. Eleanor, you realize you could buy your son's house several times over? He asked once, reviewing my statements. What would be the point of that? I replied. George gave me a long look. You know, most of my clients can't wait to tell their kids about their inheritance. Take them on lavish trips, buy them cars. I set down my teacup. Frank and I agreed long ago. Money reveals character. It doesn't build it. Truthfully, I'd almost told them many times. When Jennifer struggled to make a down payment on her first home, or when Zach needed braces that Robert complained about paying for. But something always held me back. A small voice warning me that once that door was opened, our relationships would fundamentally change. Instead, I helped in quieter ways. Anonymous college funds established for both grandchildren. A lucky investment opportunity that came Jennifer's way through a work connection. Small things that wouldn't reveal the full picture. As Robert's financial pressures grew, the house in West Hills, the private schools, Vanessa's design, business that consumed money but produced little income, his patience with me seemed to wane. Each time he visited, his eyes would scan my living room with barely disguised disapproval. Mom, this furniture has to be 30 years old, he said, during one visit last summer. It's comfortable, I replied, and well made. Things used to be built to last. He sighed dramatically. We worry about you living like this. There's no shame in accepting help, you know. I looked around my cozy living room with its bookshelves, family photos, and the quilt Frank's mother had made for our wedding. What Robert saw as outdated, I recognized as valuable. What he interpreted as struggling, I knew as choice. I'm doing just fine, Robert, I said firmly. A flash of irritation crossed his face. Are you, though? Your refrigerator makes that weird noise. Your car is practically ancient, and you still haven't hired someone to clean the gutters like I suggested. I have a handyman who helps with things I can't manage. A handyman, he repeated, with the same tone he might use for witch doctor. Mom, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You're not thinking practically. What Robert didn't understand was that practicality had guided every decision of my adult life. The ancient car was paid for and meticulously maintained. The handyman was the brother of a dear friend who needed the work. My life was arranged exactly as I wanted it, comfortable, debt-free, and quietly abundant. As Thanksgiving approached this year, the tension had been building for months. Robert's calls had grown shorter, more perfunctory. When he suggested I join them for the holiday, his tone implied obligation rather than desire. Vanessa's parents. We'll be there, he added, as though offering compensation for my company. That sounds lovely, I said. Should I bring anything? Just yourself, he replied, then added, and maybe take a look at those brochures I left. The senior community has a special right now for new residents. I felt a flicker of anger but tamped it down. I'll see you Thursday, Robert. The morning of Thanksgiving, I dressed carefully in a simple navy dress, pearl earrings Frank had given me on our 20th anniversary, and sensible but polished shoes. I applied light makeup and arranged my silver hair the way Frank had always liked it. In my purse, alongside my wallet and keys, I placed the bank statements George had provided, not with any intention of revealing them, but as a private reminder to myself of the truth. I also tucked in a small envelope containing a check, my annual contribution to the children's college funds, disguised as a modest holiday gift. It wasn't much compared to what they would eventually receive, but it was part of the careful dance I'd been performing for years. As I drove to Robert's sprawling house in the West Hills, I rehearsed pleasant topics of conversation: Jennifer's new promotion, Zach's baseball tournament, the volunteer work I'd been doing at the community center. Nothing controversial, nothing that would provoke Robert's increasingly judgmental attitudes about how I chose to live. I couldn't have imagined then how completely those plans would unravel, or how a single comment over pumpkin pie would finally force me to confront the painful truth about my son and myself. When I arrived at Robert's house, the driveway was already filled with cars. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I parked on the street and made my way up the winding path to the front door, noting the new landscaping that must have cost a small fortune. Before I could ring the bell, the door swung open to reveal Sophie, my 10-year-old granddaughter, her face bright with genuine pleasure. "Grandma, you're here!" She threw her arms around my waist, and for a moment, all my apprehension melted away. "There's my girl," I said, hugging her close. "How's my favorite artist?" Sophie pulled back, eager to share. "I made a new painting for art class. Ms. Winters said it was exceptionally good. That's the word she used, exceptional." "Well, that doesn't surprise me one bit," I told her, following her into the house. "I've always said you have a special eye for beauty." The entryway of Robert's home always took my breath away. Soaring ceilings, marble floors, a chandelier that must have cost more than my first car. It was impressive, certainly, but lacked the warmth of a place that had been truly lived in. Vanessa appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron that looked more decorative than functional. "Eleanor, you're right on time. The Carmichaels just arrived." I noticed she said Eleanor rather than Mom, a subtle distinction that had emerged over the years. I handed her the bottle of wine I'd brought, nothing extravagant, but a good vintage I knew Robert favored. "This is lovely," she said, barely glancing at the label. "Robert's in the living room with his clients." "Clients, at Thanksgiving dinner." I nodded and made my way through to the expansive living room, where Robert stood with a drink in hand, laughing too loudly with a couple I didn't recognize. When he saw me, there was the briefest hesitation before his smile repositioned itself. "Mom, you made it." He leaned in for a perfunctory kiss on my cheek. "Let me introduce you to Tom and Diane Carmichael. Tom heads the advertising department at Pacific Northwest Bank." I extended my hand, noting how Robert had introduced me simply as Mom, with no mention of my name or my own accomplished career. "Lovely to meet you both. Are you enjoying this unseasonably dry November?" Small talk carried us through until dinner was announced. The table was picture perfect, Vanessa's designer touch evident in every carefully placed decoration. Crystal glasses caught the light from the expensive tapered candles. The turkey glistened. Everything looked like it belonged in a magazine. Spread. "Eleanor, would you like to sit next to Zach?" Vanessa gestured to a chair near the middle of the table, far from the host position Robert occupied at the head. As everyone settled in, Robert raised his glass. "Before we begin, I'd like to toast to a successful year. Pacific Northwest's campaign has exceeded all projections, and we've just signed a contract for the West Ridge development that will carry us well into the new fiscal year." It was a toast more appropriate for a business dinner than a family Thanksgiving, but everyone dutifully raised their glasses. I caught Sophie's eye across the table and gave her a small wink, which she returned with a grin. Conversation flowed around business successes, vacation plans, and the Carmichaels' recent home renovation. I spoke when addressed, but otherwise focused on connecting with my grandchildren, asking Zach about his science project and listening to Sophie describe her latest art endeavor. "So, Eleanor," Tom Carmichael turned to me during a lull. "Robert tells me you're retired now. What did you do before?" Before Robert could answer for me, I smiled. I worked in financial systems for Meridian Technologies for about 20 years. After that, I did independent consulting until I retired. Mom worked with numbers, Robert interjected, his tone suggesting a clerical rather than executive position. Nothing too exciting. I found it quite exciting, I countered mildly. Especially developing the inventory tracking system that became standard across the industry. Robert's expression tightened slightly. Ancient history now, he said dismissively. Technology's moved way beyond those old systems. I could have mentioned that the patent still generated substantial royalties, or that my old system had been the foundation for developments still in use today. Instead, I turned to Sophie and asked about her upcoming school play. The subtle dismissals continued throughout dinner. When I mentioned volunteering at the community center, Robert framed it as Mom needs something to keep her busy. When I declined a second glass of wine, he commented, Mom has to be careful driving that old car of hers. Each comment reinforced the narrative he'd constructed. His aging mother, somewhat feeble, in need of guidance and oversight. I felt myself being diminished, reduced to a caricature that bore little resemblance to the woman who managed millions in assets and had just last week approved a significant investment in a developing renewable energy technology. Still, I maintained my composure. This was Thanksgiving, after all, and I had no desire to create tension in front of the grandchildren or guests. The dinner plates were cleared, dessert was served, and I thought the worst had passed. Then Zach, with the innocent directness of a 14-year-old, changed everything. Dad, can I get a new laptop for Christmas? Brandon just got the latest MacBook Pro, and mine is seriously ancient. Robert sighed. We've discussed this, Zach. Between your sister's art camp and the house renovations, we need to be mindful of expenses right now. But you just said your business is doing great, Zach persisted. That's different. Robert's voice took on the edge I recognized as rising frustration. Business success doesn't mean unlimited personal spending. I couldn't help myself. A good lesson about financial management, I offered. Though if Zach needs a computer for school, I'd be happy to help. Robert cut me off sharply. We don't need your help, Mom. We're doing just fine. The table went quiet. Even the Carmichaels seemed to sense the sudden tension. I only meant... I began. I know exactly what you meant, Robert said. You've always loved to jump in and save the day, haven't you? But we're handling our family's needs ourselves. Vanessa touched his arm lightly. Robert, I'm sure your mother was just being generous. He shook her hand away. Yes, generous with money she should be saving for herself. Because who do you think will have to take care of her when that little pension runs out? Who has to drive across town to check on her when she can't be bothered to consider moving somewhere more practical? My checks burned. I've never asked you to take care of me, Robert. Not yet, he scoffed. But it's coming, isn't it? The house you refuse to sell, the retirement savings that can't possibly last at the rate healthcare costs are rising. I placed my napkin on the table, my hands perfectly steady despite the turmoil inside. I assure you, my finances are in order. He laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. Right, that's why you're driving a 15-year-old car and shopping at discount stores. I choose to live simply, I said quietly. That doesn't mean I'm struggling. Mom, stop. He set down his fork with more force than necessary. It's exhausting, this pride of yours. We all know retired teachers don't exactly retire rich. I hadn't taught in over 30 years, having moved into corporate finance before Robert was even in high school. The fact that he still framed my entire career this way spoke volumes. I think we should change the subject, I suggested, acutely aware of Sophie's wide eyes and the Carmichaels' uncomfortable expressions. Fine, Robert said, his voice rising. Let's change it to something more pleasant than my mother's financial delusions. Like the fact that I'm constantly having to worry about her on top of everything else. No one has asked you to worry, I said, my own temper finally beginning to fray. That's the problem with your generation. he continued as though I hadn't spoken. You never plan ahead, and then your kids have to pick up the pieces. The unfairness of this statement, after decades of careful planning and meticulous financial management, was simply too much. Robert, that's enough, I said firmly. He looked at me then, really looked at me, with an expression I'd never seen directed my way before, contempt mixed with resignation. You're right. It is enough, he said coldly. It's enough pretending this isn't a problem. You're just a burden, Mom. We're always having to check on you, drive you places, worry about your bills. When are you going to start thinking about how this affects us? The table fell silent. The word hung in the air, burden, sharp, and irretrievable. In my purse, just inches from my hand, sat bank statements that could have silenced him instantly. Proof that not only was I not a burden, but I could have purchased his entire life several times over had I wished to. Instead, I carefully placed my napkin beside my plate, rose from my chair, and looked at my son. Thank you for dinner, Vanessa, I said, my voice remarkably steady. I think it's best if I go now. Grandma, no. Sophie's distress was immediate. Dad didn't mean it. But the look on Robert's face told me he had meant every word. He believed I was a burden, a responsibility he resented, an obligation he fulfilled grudgingly. The truth of our relationship lay exposed beneath the crystal and fine china, ugly and undeniable. Without another word, I retrieved my coat and purse, hugged my grandchildren quickly, and walked out into the cold November. Evening. Behind me, I could hear Vanessa's hissed admonishments and Robert's defensive responses. As I drove away from my son's beautiful house with its impressive view and overwhelming mortgage, a strange calm settled over me. For years, I had protected Robert from the truth of my financial situation, believing I was preserving something valuable. His independence, his work ethic, our authentic relationship. But sitting at that Thanksgiving table, I had finally seen the truth. In trying to protect him from my money, I had failed to protect myself from his judgment. In keeping my fortune secret, I had allowed him to construct a narrative that diminished everything I was. The word burden echoed in my mind as I drove through the darkening streets of Portland, heading not toward my modest ranch house, but in another direction entirely. It was time for some changes, beginning tonight. I drove through the night with tears blurring my vision, but I didn't head home. Instead, I found myself winding along the coastal highway, streetlights giving way to darkness until only my headlights illuminated the empty road ahead. 2 hours later, I pulled into the private driveway of my secret sanctuary, the beachfront cottage at Cannon Beach that no one in my family knew about. The key was hidden where it always was, beneath a weathered piece of driftwood shaped like a crescent moon. The cottage welcomed me with familiar shadows, the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore providing a steady rhythm that calmed my racing heart. I didn't bother with lights at first, just stood in the darkness letting the weight of Robert's words settle around me like heavy stones. Burden. The word tasted bitter. After everything I'd done, everything I'd sacrificed, my own son saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience, a problem to be managed. I fumbled for the light switch, illuminating the cozy living room with its comfortable furniture and walls, lined with books. Unlike my primary residence, I'd indulged myself here. Original artwork, plush rugs, a top-of-the-line kitchen. This was where I allowed myself to live with the wealth I'd earned but never flaunted. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the large picture window overlooking the moonlit beach. The ocean stretched endlessly before me, vast and indifferent to human concerns. It struck me then, with perfect clarity, that I'd been living an incomplete life, one divided between appearances and reality, between what I allowed others to see and what I kept hidden. My phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa. Eleanor, Robert is upset but didn't mean what he said. Please call when you get home safely. No apology. No acknowledgement of how deeply his words had cut. Just the expectation that I would forgive, as I always had, and life would continue its familiar pattern. I switched off my phone without responding, and spent the night alternating between tears and a strange, liberating anger. By morning, as the sun rose over the Pacific, painting the water in shades of rose and gold, I had made my decision. The charade was over. It was time to live authentically, regardless of the consequences. I spent the next 3 days at the beach, house, thinking, planning, and occasionally walking along the shore, letting the cold wind clear my head. On Sunday evening, I finally returned to Portland, recharged and resolved. The first thing I did was call George Mitchell. "I need to make some changes," I told him directly. "It's time to stop hiding." George, who had been advising me to be more transparent about my finances for years, didn't sound surprised. "What kind of changes did you have in mind, Eleanor?" "Everything," I replied. "I'm selling the ranch house for starters, and I want to update my will." "Finally," he sighed with evident relief. "What brought this on? The last time we discussed this, you were adamant about maintaining the status quo." I hesitated, the word burden echoing in my mind again. "Let's just say I've realized that secrets, even well-intentioned ones, can do more harm than good." The next morning, I contacted a realtor and listed my house for sale. By Wednesday, I had 3 offers well above asking price. I accepted the highest one, a young family with 2 small children who fell in love with the backyard where Robert and Jennifer had once played. The house deserved to be filled with laughter again. I hadn't responded to any of Robert's messages, which had evolved from Vanessa's initial non-apology to increasingly frustrated demands for contact. "Mom, you need to pick up. This silent treatment is childish," read the latest one. I almost laughed at the irony. My successful, confident son reduced to petulant texts because his mother had finally refused to play by his rules. Instead of calling, I sent a brief message. "I'm fine. Taking some time for myself. We'll be in touch when I'm ready." His response was immediate. "Ready for what?" "Mom, you're overreacting. It was a stressful day. Things were said. Can we move on?" Move on, as if his words had been nothing more than a passing irritation, like a fly at a picnic. I put the phone away without responding and continued with my plans. The realtor had connected me with a stylish condominium in the Pearl District, Portland's arts neighborhood. The space was modern and open, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a balcony overlooking the city. It cost 3 times what I would earn from selling the ranch house, but money wasn't an issue. For the first time in decades, I allowed myself to purchase what I wanted without considering how it might appear to others. I hired a designer, selected furnishings that pleased me rather than met some artificial standard of appropriate for a woman my age, and arranged for the movers to come the following week. I donated much of my old furniture to a women's shelter and kept only those pieces with genuine sentimental value: Frank's reading chair, our wedding photo, the quilt his mother had made. Through it all, Robert continued his campaign of texts and voicemails, each one more demanding than the last. "Mom, Zach has a game this weekend. He's expecting you to be there." And later, "Vanessa says she stopped by the house and no one answered. Are you deliberately avoiding us?" Finally, after nearly 2 weeks of silence, he escalated to what he clearly thought was his nuclear option. "If you don't respond, I'm going to call the police for a welfare check. This isn't normal behavior." That was when I finally called him back. "There's no need for the police," I said when he answered, my voice calm and controlled. "I'm perfectly fine." "Mom!" Relief and irritation mingled in his voice. "Where have you been? We've been worried sick." "I told you I was taking some time for myself. I needed to think." "Think about what?" "Look, if this is still about Thanksgiving, I've apologized. What more do you want?" I paused, considering my words carefully. You haven't apologized, Robert. Not once. You've justified, you've minimized, but you haven't actually apologized. The silence on his end was telling. Finally, he sighed dramatically. Fine. I'm sorry if what I said hurt your feelings. It came out wrong. Now can we please move past this? I am moving past it, I replied. In fact, I've sold the house. You what? His shock was almost comical. Mom, are you serious? Why? Would you do something like that without talking to us first? I don't need permission to sell my own property, Robert. But where are you going to live? Please tell me you're not moving to that depressing senior community. I've purchased a condominium downtown. I move in next week. Another stunned silence. How can you possibly afford a condo downtown? Those places cost a fortune. And there it was, the assumption that had underpinned our relationship for so long. The belief that I was financially vulnerable, teetering on the edge of dependence. I can afford it, I said simply. Money isn't an issue. What does that mean? His voice had taken on a sharp edge. Mom, have you been keeping secrets from us? We'll discuss everything soon, I promised. I'm hosting a family dinner next. Saturday at my new place. I'd like you, Vanessa, and the children to come. I've already spoken to Jennifer, and she and Paul are flying in. Jennifer's coming? You told her about selling the house before telling me? I ignored the accusation in his voice. Saturday? At 6. I'll text you the address. And Robert? This is important. I need everyone to be there. He agreed, though not without further protestations and questions, all of which I deflected. The conversation ended with him still confused and slightly angry, but I felt lighter than I had in years. The truth was finally coming to light, one piece at a time. The move itself was surprisingly painless. The company I hired handled everything efficiently, and by Friday afternoon, I was settling into my new home. The space felt both foreign and right, like slipping into an elegant dress after years of wearing only comfortable but faded clothes. George arrived that evening with a bottle of champagne and a worried expression. Are you sure about this, Eleanor? Revealing everything at once could be quite a shock. I gestured around the beautifully appointed living room, with its expansive views of the city lights beginning to twinkle in the twilight. I'm done hiding, George. If Robert can't handle the truth, that's his problem, not mine. George studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. I've never seen you like this before. It suits you. We shared the champagne and finalized the details for the next day's gathering. George would be there as my financial advisor, ready to explain the full extent of my assets and the changes I'd made to my estate planning. It wasn't going to be an easy conversation, but it was a necessary one. Jennifer and Paul arrived early Saturday morning, their flight having landed at dawn. I'd arranged for a car to bring them directly to the condo, and the moment I opened the door, Jennifer threw her arms around me. Mom, this place is incredible. She pulled back, her eyes scanning my face anxiously. Are you really okay? When you called about Robert and Thanksgiving, I couldn't believe it. I'm better than okay, I assured her, hugging Paul as well. Come in, let me show you around. Jennifer had always been more perceptive than her brother, more attuned to the emotional undercurrents in our family. As we toured the condo, she asked thoughtful questions about my decision to move, commenting on how the space seemed to reflect me in a way the old house never had. You seem different, she said finally, as we stood on the balcony overlooking the city. More. Yourself. I smiled, touched by her insight. That's exactly how I feel. For too long, I've been living a half-life, Jennifer, afraid that if I showed who I really was, what I really had, it would change how you and Robert saw me. Nothing could change how I see you, Mom, she said softly. You're the strongest person I know. Paul nodded in agreement. Jennifer's right. And for what it's worth, I think it's about time Robert learned who his mother really is. The warmth of their support carried me through the preparations for dinner. I'd arranged for a catering service, something I would never have done in the past, and the dining room table was set with the fine china and silver that had been stored away for special occasions that somehow never seemed to come. At precisely 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I took a deep breath, squeezed Jennifer's hand for reassurance, and went to greet the rest of my family. Robert's expression as he stepped into the foyer was priceless, eyes widening as he took in the soaring ceilings, the artwork, the unmistakable luxury of the space. Vanessa made no attempt to hide her shock, her gaze darting from one expensive fixture to another with naked assessment. "Grandma, this place is awesome!" Zach exclaimed, breaking the tense silence. "You can see the whole city from here." Sophie was already moving toward the windows, her artist's eye drawn to the panoramic view. "It's like living in the sky." I welcomed them all, accepting brief, awkward hugs from Robert and Vanessa, before leading them into the living room, where Jennifer and Paul waited. George stood near the fireplace, professional in his tailored suit, a folder tucked discreetly under his arm. "You remember George Mitchell," I said to Robert. "He was your father's closest friend." Robert nodded, stiffly. "Of course, though I'm not sure why your financial advisor needs to be at a family dinner." "All in good time," I replied, gesturing toward the seating area. "Shall we have a drink before dinner?" The next hour was a strange dance of superficial conversation, layered over obvious tension. Robert kept glancing around the condo, his expression growing increasingly confused and suspicious. Vanessa made several probing comments about the cost of various items, which I neither confirmed nor denied. The children, blissfully unaware of the undercurrents, chatted enthusiastically about school and friends. When we finally moved to the dining room for dinner, Robert could contain himself no longer. "All right, Mom, what's going on? First you disappear for 2 weeks, then you sell the house without telling anyone, and now you're living in a place that must cost more than my annual salary. Where is this money coming from?" I carefully placed my napkin in my lap, looking directly at my son. "That's why I asked everyone to come tonight, Robert. It's time for some honesty." "What does that mean?" His voice had taken on the sharp edge I recognized from Thanksgiving. "Have you been lying to us?" "Not lying," I corrected gently. "But not telling the whole truth either. George, would you mind?" George stepped forward, opening the folder he'd been holding. "I've been Eleanor's financial advisor for over 30 years, he began, his tone professional but kind. "In that time, I've helped her manage a substantial portfolio that currently has a net worth of approximately $22 million. The silence that followed was absolute. Robert's mouth actually fell open, his fork suspended halfway to his lips. Vanessa went completely still, her eyes fixed on George as though she hadn't quite processed what he'd said. "22 million?" Robert finally choked out. That's impossible." "It's not only possible, it's accurate," George replied, placing several documents on the table. "Eleanor and Frank made some exceptionally wise investments early in their marriage. The royalties from the inventory tracking system patent alone generate several $100,000 annually. Add to that her corporate board positions, smart real estate investments, and conservative but steady portfolio growth." "But you lived so simply," Vanessa interrupted, still struggling to comprehend. "Your clothes, your car." "By choice," I said quietly. "Frank and I agreed long ago that wealth shouldn't change how we lived or raised our children. We wanted you to develop your own work ethic, your own values, without the distortion that sudden wealth can bring." Robert's face had drained of color. "All this time, while I've been worrying about you, thinking you were struggling on a teacher's pension." "I haven't been a teacher since before you started high school, Robert," I pointed out. "I was an executive at Meridian Technologies for 20 years. I served on 3 corporate boards after that. My little consulting work was advising Fortune 500 companies on financial systems integration. "Why didn't you tell us?" Jennifer asked softly, not accusatory, but genuinely curious. I glanced at her, grateful for her calm presence. "At first, it was because your father and I wanted you both to grow up normally, not burdened by wealth or defined by it. Later." I turned my gaze back to Robert. "Later, I worried that knowing would change our relationships fundamentally. That you'd see me differently. Or worse, that you'd see yourselves differently." "So instead, you let us believe a lie," Robert snapped, anger beginning to replace his shock. "You let me worry about your future, stress about how we'd handle your care if you became ill." "I never asked you to worry," I reminded him gently. "In fact, I repeatedly told you I was fine. You chose not to believe me, because you were living like you were one step away from a retirement home." His voice rose sharply. The old car, the outdated furniture, refusing help even when it was offered. What was I supposed to think? Perhaps that I knew my own mind? That I was capable of making my own choices? I suggested, keeping my tone even. "Robert, I lived simply because I wanted to, not because I had to. The difference matters." Vanessa finally found her voice again. "All those times we invited you to holidays, birthdays, we thought we were helping you, making sure you weren't alone." "And I appreciated those invitations," I assured her. "Family gatherings should never be about money. Who has it? Who doesn't? They should be about connection." "Connection?" Robert almost spat the word. "Is that what you call letting your son believe his mother might need financial assistance? Watching me stress about your future while you're secretly sitting on millions?" "Robert," Paul interjected, his tone warning. "Your mother doesn't owe you an explanation for how she manages her own money." But Robert was too far gone, too deep in his sense of betrayal to hear the reason in Paul's words. "Oh, of course you'd defend her. Did you know about this? Were Jennifer and Paul in on the secret all along?" "No one knew," I said firmly. "Not Jennifer, not Paul, not anyone except George and my attorney." "So why tell us now?" Robert demanded. "Why the sudden change of heart?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself for what needed to be said. "Because at Thanksgiving, you made something very clear to me, Robert. You showed me that the relationship I thought we had, one based on love and respect, wasn't real. It was based on a fundamental misunderstanding." "What are you talking about?" "You called me a burden," I said simply. "You resented the time and attention you felt obligated to give me. You saw me as a problem to be managed, not as a person, to be valued." Robert had the grace to flush with embarrassment. I was upset. It was a stressful day. Perhaps. "But what troubles me isn't that you said it. It's that you believed it. You truly saw me as dependent, incapable, a responsibility you had to shoulder unwillingly." The children had gone very quiet, sensing the gravity of the conversation even if they didn't fully understand its implications. Sophie looked particularly distressed, her eyes darting between her father and me. "I think the kids should go watch TV in the den," Jennifer suggested gently. I nodded, grateful for her intervention. Once Zach and Sophie had reluctantly left the room, I continued. "I'm not angry about what happened at Thanksgiving, Robert. In a strange way, I'm grateful. It forced me to see that my well-intentioned secrecy had created a fundamental dishonesty in our relationship. You didn't know who I really was, and as a result, you couldn't truly respect me. So this is what? Some kind of punishment? A big reveal to put me in my place?" Robert's voice had taken on a defensive edge. "No," I said quietly. "It's an invitation to start over, to build a relationship based on truth, not assumptions." George cleared his throat. "There's more, Eleanor. The estate planning changes. Robert's head snapped up. Estate planning? What changes? I nodded to George, who continued. Eleanor has restructured her will and established several trusts. The details are complex, but the essence is this. The bulk of the estate will be divided equally between Jennifer and Robert, with substantial educational trusts established for Zach, Sophie, and any future grandchildren. However, I interjected, meeting Robert's gaze steadily, there are conditions. Conditions? Robert echoed, wariness replacing some of his anger. What kind of conditions? The inheritance is tied to demonstrated ethical behavior and community contribution, George explained. An independent trustee will evaluate adherence to these conditions. In simple terms, how you treat others, particularly those you perceive as having less power or status than yourself, will directly impact your inheritance. Robert stared at me in disbelief. You're dictating how I behave from beyond the grave? This is manipulation. It's a choice, I corrected him. Your behavior, your values, those are always your choice, Robert. The consequences of those choices are simply being made explicit. And what about Jennifer? Does she have conditions too? His tone was scathing. The same conditions apply to everyone, I confirmed. This isn't about punishing you, Robert. It's about encouraging the values your father and I always tried to instill: compassion, integrity, respect for all people regardless of their circumstances. I can't believe this, he muttered, pushing back from the table. All these years letting us think you were struggling, and now you're using your money to control us. That's not fair, Robert, Jennifer said, her voice quiet but firm. Mom has every right to distribute her estate however she chooses. She earned that money. Of course you'd take her side, he snapped. Perfect Jennifer, who visits twice a year and calls on Sundays. You haven't had to deal with the day-to-day reality of an aging parent. The reality you're describing is one you created, I pointed out. I never asked for your supervision or your concern. Those were assumptions you made based on an incomplete picture. Vanessa, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. All those times we invited you for holidays, drove across town to check on you, was that all just a joke to you? Watching us worry while you secretly had millions? It was never a joke, I replied, feeling a twinge of genuine regret. I appreciated your concern, even as I tried to assure you it wasn't necessary. But I've realized that my desire to protect you from the complications of wealth ended up creating a different kind of problem, one where you saw me as less capable, less complete than I actually am. Robert stood abruptly. I need some air. Robert, I began, but he was already striding toward the balcony, his shoulders rigid with tension. Vanessa hesitated, then followed him, leaving me alone with Jennifer, Paul, and George at the suddenly too large dining table. Well, George said after a moment, that went about as expected. He'll come around, Mom, Jennifer assured me, reaching across to squeeze my hand. He just needs time to process. Maybe, I said, watching my son's silhouette against the city lights. But I think what he really needs is to see me clearly for the first time. Not as the mother who raised him, or the burden he feared I'd become, but as the person I actually am. With strengths and weaknesses, successes and failures. A whole person, not just a role. And if he can't do that? Paul asked quietly. I turned back to the table, my resolve firm despite the ache in my heart. Then that's his choice. I can't make Robert respect me, or even love me for who I truly am. I can only give him the opportunity to try. Through the glass doors, I could see Robert gesturing animatedly, Vanessa's head shaking in response. They were clearly arguing, their body language tense and defensive. For a moment, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake, if revealing the truth had irrevocably damaged our already fragile relationship. But then I remembered the word that had set this all in motion: burden. And I knew, regardless of what happened next, that I had made the right choice. Because living a half-truth for the comfort of others wasn't really living at all. The night air had grown chilly by the time Robert and Vanessa returned inside. Their faces were composed, but their eyes held a wariness that suggested our conversation was far from over. "The children have school tomorrow," Vanessa said stiffly. "We should be going." I nodded, rising from my chair. "Of course. Thank you for coming. Please tell Zach and Sophie I'll call them tomorrow." Robert cleared his throat. "Mom, This is a lot to process. I need some time." "I understand," I said simply. "Take all the time you need." As they gathered the children and prepared to leave, I stood in the doorway of my new home, a space that reflected who I truly was, not who I had pretended to be. Robert paused on the threshold, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "$22 million, he said, almost to himself. "All this time." "It was never about the money, Robert," I told him softly. "It was about being seen for who I am, not what I have, or what you thought I lacked." He shook his head slightly, as though trying to reconcile the mother he had known with the woman standing before him now. "I don't know who you are anymore." "That's the thing, Robert," I replied, a sad smile touching my lips. "You never really did, but now you have the chance to find out, if you want to." He didn't answer, just turned and walked toward the elevator where Vanessa and the children waited. I watched until the doors closed, then slowly shut my own door, and leaned against it, emotionally exhausted but strangely liberated. Jennifer approached, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "You okay?" "I will be," I assured her, straightening my spine. This was long overdue. "What happens now?" she asked. I looked around the beautiful space that represented my new beginning, my authentic life. "Now we wait. Robert has a choice to make. He can either accept me as I am, with all my complexities, or he can cling to the simplified version of me he's created in his mind." "And if he chooses wrong?" Paul asked, joining us. I smiled, feeling stronger than I had in years. "Then I'll be disappointed, but not defeated. I've spent too many years living according to others' expectations. I won't do it anymore, not even for my son." As Jennifer and Paul prepared the guest room for their stay, I walked out onto the balcony where Robert and Vanessa had argued earlier. The city sprawled before me, lights twinkling against the night sky like earthbound stars. Somewhere out there, my son was driving home, his understanding of his mother, and perhaps himself, fundamentally altered. I had no way of knowing what tomorrow would bring, whether Robert would retreat further into resentment or find his way toward acceptance. But for the first time in decades, I felt fully present in my own life, no longer hidden behind a carefully constructed facade. The word burden had wounded me deeply, but it had also set me free. And that, I realized as I gazed out at the horizon, was a gift I never expected to receive. 2 weeks passed with no word from Robert. The silence was deafening but not entirely unexpected. I knew my son well enough to recognize that his pride had been wounded, his worldview shaken. He needed time to reconcile the mother he thought he knew with the reality now confronting him. Jennifer and Paul stayed for 3 days after the revelation, dinner, offering support and perspective before flying back to Minnesota. In their absence, I settled into my new life with surprising ease. The Pearl District condo quickly began to feel like home. I established a morning routine, coffee on the balcony watching the city come alive, a brisk walk through the neighborhood, then either volunteer work at the community center or meetings with various investment partners. For the first time in 2 decades, I wasn't tempering my actions or moderating my lifestyle to maintain an illusion. The freedom was intoxicating. I spoke with Zach and Sophie regularly, careful not to put them in the middle of the tension between their father and me. They were fascinated by my new home, especially the building's rooftop garden where I'd started growing herbs and flowers in colorful ceramic pots. "Dad's been weird," Zach confided during one of our phone conversations. "He keeps looking at old photo albums and not talking much." "Your father has a lot to think about," I replied neutrally. "Change isn't easy for anyone." "He told Mom he doesn't know who you are anymore," Sophie added, her young voice troubled. "But you're still just Grandma, right?" The innocence of her question made my heart ache. "I'm still me, sweetheart." Sometimes adults have complicated feelings when they discover new things about people they thought they knew everything about. Like when I found out Zach was afraid of butterflies. "Even though he pretends to be so brave?" she asked, giggling. "Hey, I'm not afraid of them. I just don't like how they flutter unpredictably," Zach protested in the background. I smiled, grateful for their resilience. "Something like that. Your dad will sort through his feelings eventually." After hanging up, I sat with my thoughts, wondering what Robert was doing with the information that had so thoroughly disrupted his perception of me. Was he angry? Confused? Perhaps even examining his own behavior? I hoped it was the latter, but experience had taught me not to expect sudden enlightenment. The following Tuesday, I received an unexpected visitor. I was reviewing some investment proposals when the concierge called to announce that Vanessa was in the lobby, asking to see me. "Send her up," I said, surprised but curious. When I opened the door, Vanessa stood there looking uncharacteristically uncertain. Gone was the polished, slightly superior daughter-in-law I was accustomed to. Instead, she seemed smaller somehow, less assured. "Eleanor," she began, then hesitated. "Thank you for seeing me. I wasn't sure you would." "Of course," I stepped aside, gesturing her in. "Would you like some tea?" She nodded, glancing around the condo with new eyes, not assessing its value as she had before, but seemingly trying to discover something about me in its furnishings and art. I busied myself, in the kitchen, giving her space to gather her thoughts. When I returned with the tea tray, she was standing by the bookshelf, examining a framed photograph of Frank and me from our early days. "You look so happy," she commented, accepting the cup I offered. "We were," I confirmed. "Not because we had money, we didn't at that point, but because we had purpose and each other." Vanessa sat on the edge of the sofa, cradling her teacup. "Robert hasn't been sleeping," she said abruptly. "He paces at night, goes through old family papers, questions everything." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said sincerely. "That wasn't my intention." "What was your intention, Eleanor?" Her question wasn't accusatory but genuinely inquisitive. "Why reveal everything now after all these years?" I considered her question carefully before answering. Because living a half-truth was damaging all of us in ways I hadn't fully recognized until Thanksgiving. Robert seeing me as dependent and somewhat pathetic. Me allowing that perception to continue to maintain peace. The children observing this. Distorted relationship between us. None of it was healthy. Vanessa looked down at her cup, her voice quiet. "He's embarrassed. Not just about what he said at Thanksgiving, but about everything, how he's treated you, the assumptions he made." "As he should be," I replied, not unkindly. "But embarrassment can be instructive if we let it be." "He's also angry," she continued. "He feels like his whole childhood was a lie." I shook my head firmly. Nothing about his childhood was a lie. Frank and I loved him and Jennifer deeply. We provided a stable, comfortable home. We encouraged their interests, supported their dreams. The only thing we didn't do was flaunt our wealth or hand them everything without effort. "But you let them believe you were struggling after Frank died," Vanessa countered. "I never said I was struggling," I corrected. "That was Robert's assumption, one I tried to dispel numerous times." He simply couldn't reconcile my lifestyle choices with his understanding of wealth. She was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Why did you live so simply? If you could afford more? Because things aren't what make a life meaningful, I said. Frank and I believe that. We wanted to model values beyond material success. Yet now you're living here, she gestured around the elegant space. This isn't exactly simple living. I smiled slightly. True. I've decided to stop hiding parts of myself, including my appreciation for beauty and comfort. The difference is that I'm making these choices consciously, not to impress others or fulfill some external expectation. Vanessa set her cup down, straightening her shoulders. Robert doesn't know I'm here. He wouldn't approve. Why did you come, Vanessa? She met my gaze directly for perhaps the first time in our relationship. Because I need to understand what happens now, for the children's sake, if nothing else. That depends largely on Robert, I replied honestly. I've made my position clear. I want a relationship with my son and his family, but not one based on false premises or lack of respect. And the money? She asked, a hint of her old directness returning. The inheritance conditions. Those stand, I said firmly. Not as punishment, but as reflection of my values. How we treat others matters, especially those we perceive as vulnerable or less fortunate. Vanessa nodded slowly, absorbing this. He thinks you don't trust him. This isn't about trust. It's about legacy. What values do I want my estate to reinforce? Certainly not the attitudes I witnessed at Thanksgiving. She flinched slightly at the reference but didn't argue. The children miss you, she said instead. Especially Sophie. She keeps asking when she can see your new sky house. They're welcome any time, I assured her, with or without Robert. They shouldn't suffer because of adult disagreements. Vanessa gathered her purse, preparing to leave. At the door, she paused. He's a good man, Eleanor. Stubborn and sometimes blind to his own flaws, but good at his core. He thought he was doing what a son should do. I know, said softly. That's why this hurts. Because his intentions weren't malicious, just misguided. But good intentions don't excuse harmful behavior. After she left, I sat on the balcony watching clouds drift across the Portland skyline, wondering if her visit signaled the beginning of reconciliation or was simply a fact-finding mission. Either way, it was the first crack in the wall of silence Robert had erected, and that gave me hope. Hope, however, proved premature. Another week passed without contact from Robert, though Sophie called twice, excited about an upcoming art show at her school. I want you to come, Grandma. I did a painting of your beach house. I froze. My beach house? The one with the big windows facing the ocean, she continued innocently. Dad found pictures on your computer when he was looking for something. He was really mad about it. My pulse quickened. Sophie, when did your father use my computer? When we went to your old house to get some papers before the new family moved in. You said it was okay, remember? I did remember. I'd given Robert permission to retrieve some family documents from my old desk. I hadn't thought to remove the photos of Cannon Beach that I'd downloaded from my digital camera. Is that a secret place? Sophie asked, concerned by my silence. No, sweetheart, not anymore, I replied, my mind racing. It's just a special place I like to visit to think. After we hung up, I immediately called George. Robert knows about the beach house, I told him without preamble. George sighed heavily. I was afraid something like this might happen. How much do you think he found? I'm not sure, just photos possibly. But it's another piece of evidence. That I wasn't what he thought I was. Do you want me to contact him? George offered. Try to explain? No, I decided. The ball is in his court now. Let's see what he does with this new information. I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, my doorbell rang at 7:30 a.m. When I checked the security monitor, Robert was standing in the hallway, his posture rigid with tension. I took a deep breath and opened the door. "Good morning, Robert." He didn't respond to the greeting, just walked past me into the condo. His eyes were shadowed, his face drawn with what looked like several days' worth of stubble, so unlike his usually meticulous appearance. "I went through the storage unit," he said without preamble. "The one Dad maintained? I found the safe." My heart sank. The safe contained documents detailing many of our early investments, property deeds, and other financial records Frank had meticulously maintained. "I see," I said, closing the door. "Would you like some coffee?" "Coffee?" he repeated incredulously. "I've just discovered that my entire understanding of my family's history is a fabrication, and you're offering coffee? What would you prefer, Robert? A full accounting of every financial decision your father and I ever made. Would that satisfy you?" He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "I want the truth. All of it. No more convenient omissions, no more protecting me." "All right," I agreed, gesturing toward the living room. "But this may take a while." For the next 3 hours, I walked Robert through the history he had never known. How his father and I had started with nothing. The small apartment where we'd lived when he was born. The inventory system patent that became the foundation of our wealth. The careful investments. The properties acquired over decades. The board. Positions I'd accepted after Frank died. Robert listened in tense silence, occasionally asking a sharp question, but mostly absorbing the narrative with an unreadable expression. "All those years after Dad died," he said finally, "when I thought you were barely getting by on his pension and your savings, you were actually, what, a millionaire many times over?" "Yes," I confirmed simply. "And the times I offered to help with bills, repairs on the house, a new car, you were just what? Laughing at me behind my back?" "I was never laughing, Robert. I was touched by your concern, even as I tried to tell you it wasn't necessary." He stood abruptly, pacing the room. "The beach house. How long have you had that?" 15 years. I bought it after your father died. It's where I go when I need space to think. All those holidays when we thought you were alone, feeling sorry for you, and you were actually at your secret beach getaway?" His voice had taken on a bitter edge. "Not all holidays," I clarified. "And I never asked for your pity, Robert. That was something you chose to give." "Because you created the conditions for it," he exploded. "Living in that old house, driving that ancient car, wearing clothes from a decade ago. What was I supposed to think? Perhaps that I valued different things? That material possessions weren't my priority?" I suggested calmly. "Or perhaps you could have simply believed me when I repeatedly told you I was fine." "Fine isn't the same as secretly wealthy," he shouted, his face flushing. "You deliberately misled us." "I chose privacy," I corrected, "and simplicity, neither of which required me to broadcast my net worth. What about trust? What about honesty? Aren't those values too?" His voice cracked slightly. I felt a pang of genuine regret. "You're right to feel hurt about that aspect, Robert. The longer I maintained the separation between my public and private lives, the harder it became to bridge that gap. I worried how you would react to learning the truth." "Well, now you know," he said bitterly. "I react badly. Is that what you wanted to find out? Some kind of twisted test?" "No test," I said quietly. "Just a recognition that things couldn't continue as they were." After Thanksgiving, it became clear that my silence was enabling a dynamic between us that was harmful to both of us. Robert stopped his pacing, suddenly looking exhausted. "You should have told us after Dad died. We had a right to know." "Perhaps," I conceded, "though I'm not convinced you would have handled it any better then." "What's that supposed to mean?" I chose my next words carefully. "You've always had certain Expectations about hierarchy, Robert. About who should defer to whom. You were quite young when you first started trying to manage me, to position yourself as the family authority after your father died. That's ridiculous, he scoffed. I was trying to help. Were you? I asked gently. Or were you trying to establish control? To elevate yourself to the decision maker? The wise protector of your supposedly fragile mother? His face flushed again, but he didn't respond immediately. Think about it, I continued. You've spent years dismissing my opinions, questioning my choices, treating my life experiences as irrelevant or outdated. Would knowing I was financially successful have changed that fundamental attitude? Or would you have simply found other reasons to position yourself as superior? That's not fair, he protested, but with less conviction. Isn't it? At Thanksgiving, you called me a burden. Not because I had ever asked for support, financial or otherwise, but because I hadn't conformed to your idea of how an aging parent should behave. I hadn't moved where you wanted, spent how you thought appropriate, or deferred to your judgment. Robert sank back onto the sofa, the anger seemingly draining out of him, replaced by a confused mixture of defensiveness and dawning self-awareness. I didn't mean it like that, he said finally, his voice lower. When I said burden, I meant. I was worried about you. All the time. That's stressful. Worry you imposed on yourself, I pointed out, against all evidence and my own assurances. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. Did Dad know you were going to keep this from us? We decided together, I told him honestly. We wanted you and Jennifer to develop your own work ethic, your own relationship with money. We saw too many of our friends' children destroyed by inherited wealth, entitled, purposeless, unable to find satisfaction in their own achievements. So you lied to us for our own good? His tone was sarcastic, but less heated than before. We created boundaries, I corrected. As all parents must do, we shared our values, responsibility, compassion, the importance of contribution, without using money as the teaching tool. Robert looked up, his expression troubled. But now you are using money as a tool. These conditions on our inheritance, that's manipulation, pure and simple. I prefer to think of it as alignment, I replied. My estate should reflect my values. You're free to live according to different principles, Robert, but you shouldn't expect to benefit from values you reject. He shook his head in frustration. You're twisting everything, making me sound like some kind of monster because I expected basic honesty from my mother. No, I said firmly. I'm holding up a mirror, Robert. What you see reflected there is your choice. Another silence fell between us, heavy with unresolved tension and years of misunderstanding. Finally, Robert stood again, moving toward the windows that overlooked the city. I don't know how to move forward from this, he admitted, his back to me. I feel like everything I thought I knew about our family was built on sand. Not everything, I said softly. The love was real, Robert. The values we tried to instill. Those were genuine. The only thing that wasn't what it seemed was our financial situation. But that colored everything else, he insisted, turning back to face me. Every interaction, every decision, every time I tried to help or advise you, it was all based on a false premise. Perhaps, I acknowledged. But consider this. If your respect and concern for me were genuine, why should they diminish with the knowledge that I'm financially secure? Shouldn't you be relieved that I'm not vulnerable, not dependent? He didn't have an immediate answer for that, which told me more than any words could have. The truth, I continued gently, is that part of you enjoyed believing I needed your guidance and protection. It gave you a sense of superiority, of control. And now that advantage has been removed, you don't quite know how to relate to me as an equal, as a whole person with wisdom and capability that might even exceed your own in some areas. That's not. he began, then stopped. I'm not that petty. It's not about pettiness, Robert. It's about the invisible hierarchies we create in our relationships. The unspoken assumptions about who leads and who follows, who advises and who receives advice. He moved back to the sofa, sitting heavily. So, what now? What do you want from me? I want a relationship based on mutual respect, I said simply. One where you see me clearly, not as the mother who raised you or the burden you feared I'd become, but as the person I actually am. And I want to see you clearly too, not just your defensive pride or your need for control, but your genuine good qualities, your dedication to your children, your professional capabilities, your potential for growth. Robert was silent for a long time, his internal struggle visible in the tension around his eyes, the set of his jaw. Finally, he sighed deeply. I need time, he said, to process all of this. I understand, I replied. Take all the time you need. As he stood to leave, he paused at the door. Sophie's art show is next Thursday evening at her school. She really wants you there. I wouldn't miss it, I promised. After he left, I sat alone in the quiet of my condo, emotionally drained but cautiously optimistic. The conversation hadn't provided the neat resolution one might hope for, but it had been honest. Perhaps the most honest exchange Robert and I had ever had. It was a beginning, however rocky. The art show proved to be a turning point of sorts. I arrived early, wanting to see Sophie's work before the crowds gathered. Her painting of the beach house was surprisingly accurate for a 10-year-old, capturing the essential lines of the cottage and the sweep of the coastline beyond. Grandma, you came! Sophie rushed toward me, her face alight with pleasure. I told you I would, I reminded her, bending to accept her enthusiastic hug. Your painting is wonderful, sweetheart. You have a real talent. Do you like how I did the waves? I used a special technique Ms. Winters showed me. As Sophie explained her artistic process, I became aware of Robert and Vanessa approaching. Robert's expression was guarded but not hostile. Eleanor, Vanessa greeted me with a polite nod. We're glad you could make it. I wouldn't have missed it, I replied, smiling at Sophie. Our family has an artist to support. Robert cleared his throat. Mom, would you like to see Zach's science project while we're here? It's displayed in the STEM lab down the hall. The inclusion, so small yet significant, felt like a tentative olive branch. I'd love to, I said simply. As we walked through the crowded hallways, parents and teachers chatting animatedly around us, Robert kept pace beside me, not rushing ahead as he might have done before. I've been thinking about what you said, he admitted quietly. About why I found it so difficult to accept you didn't need my help or advice. And I prompted gently when he didn't continue. And maybe there's some truth to it, he conceded. It's uncomfortable to consider, but I'm trying. It wasn't a full acknowledgement, but it was an important step. That's all anyone can ask, I told him. Later, as we stood admiring Zach's impressive display on renewable energy, Robert surprised me again. Would you consider having dinner with us next week? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. At our house, just family. I recognized the invitation for what it was, not a complete reconciliation, but a willingness to try, to begin rebuilding on more honest foundations. I'd like that very much, I replied, careful not to overreact to this fragile new beginning. As I prepared to leave, Sophie hugged me tightly once more. Dad says maybe we can visit your beach house someday. Is that really okay? I looked at Robert over her head, his expression a complex mixture of lingering resentment and genuine effort. Yes, I told her, maintaining eye contact with my son. I think that would be wonderful. When everyone is ready. The drive home that evening felt different somehow, as though a weight had shifted, not disappeared entirely, but redistributed in a way that made it more bearable. The word burden still echoed occasionally in my mind, but its power to wound was diminishing. I had lived too much of my life in careful compartments, presenting different versions of myself to different people. Now, for better or worse, all those barriers had come down. The integration was sometimes painful, often messy, but ultimately necessary. For the first time in decades, I was fully myself, not just a mother or a widow or a wealthy woman pretending otherwise, but all of these things and more. As I entered my condo, the city lights sparkling beyond the windows, I felt a deep sense of peace despite the unresolved tensions with Robert. The truth hadn't fixed everything, but it had created the possibility of something more authentic between us. And that, I realized as I watched a plane's lights move slowly across the night sky, was worth more than all the millions in my accounts. The breaking point that had started at Thanksgiving, painful as it was, had ultimately created an opening for something new to emerge. Not a fairy tale resolution, but a more honest beginning. And at 65, I was finally ready to embrace that beginning, whatever it might bring. Family dinner at Robert and Vanessa's house proved to be a delicate dance of new boundaries and cautious conversation. The formal dining room felt different somehow. The expensive furniture and carefully curated decor now seemed less impressive, more like props in a performance of success. Vanessa had prepared an elaborate meal, clearly making an effort, though the tension in her movements betrayed her nervousness. "This salmon is delicious," I commented, searching for neutral ground. "Is that dill in the sauce?" "Yes, it's a new recipe," Vanessa replied, visibly relieved to discuss something uncomplicated. "I found it in that cooking magazine you gave me for Christmas." Robert remained mostly quiet, watching our interaction with an intensity that suggested he was analyzing every word, every gesture. The children, blessedly oblivious to the undercurrents, carried most of the conversation. Zach describing his science club's upcoming competition, Sophie recounting her art teacher's praise for her. "Beach house painting. Ms. Winters said my use of perspective shows natural talent," she announced proudly. "That doesn't surprise me at all," I told her warmly. "You've always had a good eye for detail." "Like Grandma," Zach added unexpectedly. "Dad says that's where Sophie gets it from." Robert looked up, momentarily startled by being quoted. "I did say that," he acknowledged, meeting my gaze briefly. "You always notice things others miss." The small acknowledgement felt significant, a recognition of a quality he valued in me, something beyond the narrow role he'd previously assigned me. After dinner, while Vanessa and the children cleared the table, Robert invited me onto the back patio. The evening was cool but pleasant, the garden meticulously maintained, another showcase of their apparent prosperity. "You're different," he said abruptly, studying me in the soft outdoor lighting. "How so?" I asked, genuinely curious about what he perceived. He gestured vaguely. "More present, confident. It's like you've been holding yourself back all these years, and now you're not." "That's perceptive," I acknowledged, "and largely accurate." "Why did you do it?" he asked, the question that seemed to haunt him most. "Keep up the pretense for so long?" I considered my answer carefully. "It started with good intentions, wanting you and Jennifer to develop your own values around money. But over time, it became a habit, then almost an identity. The longer I maintained the division between my public and private lives, the harder it became to bridge the gap. But after Frank died, I was grieving, trying to find my footing in a world without him," I explained. "By then, you were already established in your career, with clear ideas about how things should be. The few times I tried to assert myself, you dismissed me as out of touch, over-emotional. It seemed easier to maintain the status quo than fight battles I wasn't ready for." Robert frowned, clearly trying to remember those interactions from his perspective. I never meant to dismiss you. Intent and impact aren't always aligned, I observed gently. You were doing what you thought best, but from where I stood, it felt like you had already decided I was incapable of managing my own affairs. He was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. And now? The conditions on the inheritance, are those still in place? Yes, I confirmed. Though I hope you understand they're not meant as punishment. They reflect my values and what I want my legacy to be. Mom, I'm not a child who needs behavioral management through financial incentives, he protested, a hint of the old defensiveness returning. No, you're not, I agreed. You're an adult making choices about how you live and what you value. Those choices have consequences. Some immediate, some long-term. The conditions simply make explicit what's already true in life. How we treat others matters. He didn't respond immediately, just looked out at the carefully manicured backyard, with its expensive landscaping and elegant outdoor furniture. Finally, he sighed. I'm trying to understand your perspective, but it's difficult. It feels like you don't trust me to do the right thing without holding money over my head. It's not about trust, Robert. It's about legacy. What do I want? My life's work to ultimately support. Certainly not the attitudes I witnessed at Thanksgiving. He flinched slightly at the reminder. I've apologized for that. Yes, you have, I acknowledged, and I've accepted that apology. But words are relatively easy. Meaningful change takes time and consistent effort. Our conversation might have continued in this vein, philosophical, slightly tense but productive, had Vanessa not interrupted with coffee and dessert. The evening concluded civilly, with plans made for the children to visit my condo the following weekend. It wasn't perfect reconciliation, but it was progress. What I couldn't have anticipated was how quickly that fragile peace would be tested, or from what unexpected direction the challenge would come. The following Tuesday, I was reviewing quarterly reports from my investment portfolio when George called, his voice uncharacteristically tense. Eleanor, I need to see you as soon as possible. Today, if you can manage it. What's wrong? I asked, immediately concerned. I'd rather discuss it in person, he replied. Can you come to my office at 2? I agreed, unsettled by his tone. George was normally unflappable. He had guided me through market crashes, economic downturns, and Frank's sudden death with steady composure. Whatever had prompted this call must be serious. His office, located in a gleaming downtown tower with views of Mount Hood on clear days, was a place of calm precision, much like George himself. But when I entered that afternoon, the atmosphere was charged with unusual tension. George rose from behind his desk, his normally immaculate appearance, slightly disheveled, as though he'd been running his hands through his hair repeatedly. Thank you for coming so quickly, he said, gesturing to a chair. Something concerning has come to my attention, and I wanted you to hear it from me first. You're worrying me, George, I said, taking the offered seat. What's happened? He slid a folder across the desk. Yesterday, I received a call from Marcus Hargrove at Pinnacle Trust. They've been approached by Robert with questions about your estate planning, specifically the trust structures and conditions we've established. I frowned, opening the folder to scan the contents, notes from the conversation, copies of emails. I don't understand. Why would Robert be contacting Pinnacle Trust? They're not involved with my affairs. No, but Marcus and I serve together. On the Financial Ethics Board. He reached out as a professional courtesy. George leaned forward, his expression grave. Eleanor, Robert isn't just asking questions. He's exploring whether there are grounds to challenge the conditions as undue influence or diminished capacity on your part. The implication took a moment to fully register. He's looking for ways to invalidate my estate plan? To contest my will while I'm still alive? George nodded grimly. It appears so. Marcus was uncomfortable with the line of questioning and wanted me to be aware. I sat back, a cold weight settling in my stomach. I thought we were making progress. The dinner last week seemed positive, if cautious. Perhaps on the surface, George agreed. But it seems Robert may be pursuing a different strategy behind the scenes. I closed the folder, trying to process this betrayal. What exactly is he hoping to accomplish? Even if he could somehow prove I'm not of sound mind, which is absurd, the bulk of my assets are already in irrevocable trusts. My guess? He's fishing for options, perhaps hoping to find some technical flaw in the documentation. George removed his glasses, polishing them absently. The fact that you concealed your financial status for so long might be used to suggest some kind of psychological instability or paranoia. That's ridiculous, I said sharply. Plenty of wealthy people maintain privacy about their finances. I agree, George assured me, and any such challenge would almost certainly fail. But the fact that he's exploring this avenue at all is concerning. It suggests he's not as accepting of the new reality as he may have appeared. I stood, moving to the window to gather my thoughts. Below, Portland continued its Tuesday afternoon rhythms, pedestrians hurrying between meetings, buses lumbering. Along congested streets. Normal life continuing while mine had just taken another unexpected turn. What would you advise? I asked finally, turning back to George. He considered for a moment. Legally, we're on solid ground. The trusts are properly established. Your capacity is unquestionable, and the conditions themselves are reasonable and ethical. But personally, he hesitated, then continued more gently. Eleanor, this may indicate that the reconciliation with Robert is more complex than it appeared. It might be wise to proceed with caution. I nodded, a deep sadness settling over me. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I need to think about how to respond. Of course, George replied. And Eleanor, I'm sorry. I know how much you hoped things were improving. The drive home was a blur, my mind cycling through possible explanations, none of them comforting. Had Robert been playing me all along, presenting a facade of acceptance while secretly plotting to undermine my wishes? Or was this a parallel track, trying to repair our relationship while simultaneously protecting what he perceived as his financial interests? Either way, it represented a fundamental breach of trust at a time when trust was already fragile between us. The word burden had wounded me deeply at Thanksgiving. But this felt worse somehow. A calculated move, rather. Then an emotional outburst. When I reached my condo, I found an unexpected visitor waiting in the lobby. Jennifer had flown in from Minnesota without warning, her face tight with concern. George called me, she explained as we rode the elevator up. He thought you might need support. I'm glad he did, I admitted, feeling a rush of gratitude for my daughter's steady presence. Though I'm sorry you had to drop everything and fly across the country. Jennifer squeezed my hand. That's what family does, Mom. Real family, not the kind that goes behind your back to financial advisors. Once inside, Jennifer made tea while I changed into more comfortable clothes. We settled on the balcony, the spring air mild and fragrant with blooms from the rooftop garden. Have you talked to Robert about this? She asked after I'd filled her in on the details. Not yet, I replied. I'm still processing it myself. Jennifer's expression hardened slightly. I can't believe he would do this, after everything you've done for him, for all of us. I'm trying not to jump to conclusions, I cautioned, though my own hurt and anger were simmering beneath the surface. There may be an explanation. What possible explanation could justify going behind your back to challenge your mental capacity? Jennifer demanded, her protective instincts flaring. That's beyond disrespectful. It's cruel. I sighed, watching. A hummingbird dart between the potted flowers. When people feel threatened, they sometimes resort to measures they would normally find unthinkable. He's not threatened, Mom. He's entitled. There's a difference. Jennifer's tone was sharp. He's always been this way, expecting the world to conform to his expectations, throwing tantrums when it doesn't. That's a bit harsh, I protested, mildly. Robert has many good qualities, too. Of course he does, Jennifer conceded. But this pattern of behavior, dismissing your agency, assuming he knows better, and now this underhanded maneuvering, it's consistent with who he's always been. The only difference is that now you're finally seeing it clearly. Her words stung because there was truth in them. Throughout my life, I had made excuses for Robert's more difficult traits, attributing them to stress or ambition, or simply a different personality type than my own. I had enabled his sense of superiority by playing the role he assigned me, the somewhat helpless mother in need of guidance and management. What should I do? I asked, genuinely uncertain. Jennifer considered this thoughtfully. First, I think you need to confront him directly. No cushioning, no making it easier for him to explain away his actions. He needs to understand that this crosses a line. And then? Then you need to be prepared to enforce consequences, she said firmly. Not punishment, but boundary setting. Make it clear that this kind of behavior damages your relationship in ways that may not be repairable. If it continues. I nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her approach. When did you get so insightful about interpersonal dynamics? She smiled slightly. Therapy helps. Paul and I hit a rough patch a few years back, remember? Our counselor was big on boundaries and consequences versus punishment. I remember, I acknowledged. And clearly it worked. You two seem stronger than ever. We are, Jennifer confirmed, but it took hard work and absolute honesty, even when it was painful. She hesitated, then added gently, the question is whether Robert is capable of that kind of honesty, with you or with himself. We spent the evening discussing strategy, deciding that a face-to-face conversation was necessary rather than a phone call that would allow Robert to evade or deflect. Jennifer suggested a neutral location, somewhere public enough to discourage outbursts, but private enough for a meaningful exchange. The tea garden at Peninsula Park, I decided finally. It's quiet this time of year, and Robert always loved it as a child. The following morning, I texted Robert. Need to speak with you about an important matter. Can you meet at Peninsula Park Tea Garden tomorrow at 11? His response came quickly. Can we discuss by phone instead? Busy with client meetings. No, I replied firmly. This requires a face-to-face conversation. 11 a.m. tomorrow. After a longer pause. Fine, see you then. Jennifer offered to accompany me, but I declined. This needs to be between Robert and me, I explained. But thank you for being here. It helps knowing I have your support. The tea garden was indeed quiet when I arrived the next day, just a few elderly couples strolling the pathways between meticulously pruned hedges and early blooming roses. I chose a bench near the central fountain, its gentle splashing providing both ambiance and a buffer against being overheard. Robert arrived precisely at 11, his business attire suggesting he'd come directly from his office. His expression was guarded, almost wary as he approached. Mom, he greeted me with a brief nod. What's so urgent we couldn't discuss it by phone? I gestured for him to sit beside me. I received some disturbing information yesterday, Robert. I was hoping you could explain it. What information? He asked, though a flicker in his eyes suggested he already knew. You contacted Marcus Hargrove at Pinnacle Trust, asking about ways to challenge the conditions in my estate plan. I kept my voice calm but direct. Specifically, you inquired about claims of undue influence or diminished capacity. Robert's face flushed, then paled. How did you— That's not important, I interrupted. What's important is understanding why my son would go behind my back to explore invalidating my clearly expressed wishes. He shifted uncomfortably on the bench. It wasn't like that. I was just gathering information, trying to understand my options. Options for what exactly? Overriding my decisions about my own estate? My tone remained measured, but I made no attempt to hide my disappointment. Mom, you have to understand, he began defensively. These conditions came out of nowhere. They feel punitive, controlling. I was just trying to protect my family's interests. Your family's interests, I repeated slowly. You mean your access to money you didn't earn and have no inherent right to. His jaw tightened. That's unfair. I'm your son. Of course I have expectations about inheritance. Everyone does. Expectations aren't entitlements, Robert. And the fact that you would consider questioning my mental capacity rather than simply respecting my choices speaks volumes. He had the grace to look ashamed, if only briefly. It was just an exploratory conversation. I never intended to actually file anything. Yet, I added pointedly, you never intended to file anything yet. We sat in tense silence for a moment, the fountain's gentle splashing a stark contrast to the turbulent emotions between us. Why didn't you just talk to me? I asked finally. If you had concerns about the conditions, why not address them directly? Robert sighed, running a hand through his hair. Because I knew you wouldn't change your mind. You made that clear. And because... He hesitated, then admitted reluctantly. Because part of me was angry. Still is angry, if I'm being honest. $22 million, Mom. All those years of worrying about you, trying to help, and you had $22 million. So this was what? Revenge for feeling foolish? I asked quietly. No. Well, maybe a little, he conceded. It's complicated. I'm still processing everything. I nodded slowly. I understand that, but while you process, I need you to understand something too. Actions have consequences, Robert. Not punishments, consequences. Natural results of choices made. What does that mean? He asked warily. It means that trust, once broken, is difficult to repair. It means that relationships require honesty and respect to flourish. I met his gaze steadily. It means that how you respond to this moment will significantly impact our relationship moving forward. Are you threatening to cut me off? He demanded, an edge of panic in his voice. I'm not threatening anything, I replied calmly. I'm stating facts. You've demonstrated that you're willing to go to considerable lengths to circumvent my wishes regarding my own estate. That knowledge necessarily changes how I view our reconciliation efforts. Robert stood abruptly, pacing a small circle before turning back to me. So what now? What do you want from me? I want you to decide who you want to be, I said simply. The son who respects his mother's autonomy and works to rebuild trust, or the man who puts financial interests above relationship and integrity. That's a false choice, he protested. I can disagree with your decisions without disrespecting you. Disagreement isn't the issue, I corrected. Your methods are. Going behind my back, exploring ways to legally challenge my competence. Those aren't actions of respectful disagreement. He fell silent, perhaps finally recognizing the gravity of his choices. After a long moment, he sat back down beside me, his posture deflated. I screwed up, he admitted quietly. I was angry and hurt, and yes, embarrassed. I acted impulsively, without thinking through the consequences. It was the most genuine thing he'd said since our conversation began. Yes, you did, I agreed, neither accusatory nor forgiving, simply acknowledging the truth. How do I fix this? He asked, an unfamiliar vulnerability in his voice. "I don't know if it can be completely fixed," I replied honestly. "Some breaches of trust leave permanent marks. But if you're genuinely asking, the place to start is with complete transparency going forward. No more behind-the-scenes maneuvering. No more presenting one face while planning another approach." "I can do that," he said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "It's not a matter of saying it, Robert. It's a matter of living it, consistently, even when it's difficult." I stood, signaling the conversation was nearing its end. "Take some time to really consider whether you can commit to that. Don't answer now. Show me through your actions in the coming weeks and months." As we walked back toward the parking area, Robert cleared his throat awkwardly. "Is Jennifer in town? Vanessa mentioned seeing her downtown yesterday." "Yes," I confirmed. "She flew in to support me when we learned about your conversations with Pinnacle Trust." Robert winced. "She must hate me right now." "She's disappointed," I corrected. "As am I. But hate isn't a productive emotion in families." We reached my car first, and I turned to face my son directly. "Robert, I want you to understand something clearly. The conditions in my estate plan aren't about controlling you or punishing you. They're about ensuring that my life's work ultimately supports values I believe in. That doesn't make me unreasonable or mentally diminished. It makes me intentional about my legacy." He nodded slowly, perhaps beginning to genuinely hear me for the first time. "I'll think about everything we've discussed. Seriously think about it, not just react." "That's all I can ask," I replied, unlocking my car. "I'll be in touch soon." As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of Robert in my rearview mirror, standing alone in the parking lot, looking somehow smaller and more uncertain than I'd seen him in years. Despite everything, my heart ached for him, for the boy he had been, for the man he was still struggling to become. Back at the condo, Jennifer was waiting anxiously. "How did it go? Did he admit it?" "He did," I confirmed, settling onto the sofa with a weary sigh, though he tried to minimize it at first. "Of course he did," Jennifer scoffed. "That's his pattern. Do something inappropriate, then act like it's no big deal when confronted." "He's trying, Jennifer," I said, feeling strangely protective of Robert despite his betrayal. "He's struggling with a complete revision of his understanding of our family dynamics. That's not easy." Jennifer sat beside me, taking my hand. "Mom, I admire your compassion, I really do. But at some point, we have to acknowledge that trying isn't enough if the behavior doesn't actually change." "You're right," I acknowledged. "And I've made it clear that this represents a serious breach of trust that won't be easily repaired." "Good," Jennifer said firmly. "And what about the estate planning? Are you considering revisions given what's happened?" I shook my head. "No. Changing the plan in response to Robert's actions would only reinforce his perception that it's punitive rather than principled. The conditions stand as they are, fair, ethical, and aligned with my values." Later that evening, as Jennifer and I shared a quiet dinner on the balcony, watching the sunset paint Portland's skyline in shades of gold and pink, my phone chimed with a text from Robert. "I've been thinking about our conversation. You're right about the trust issue. I betrayed that trust and I'm genuinely sorry. No excuses. I've contacted Marcus Hargrove to retract my inquiries completely. I don't expect this to fix everything, but I want you to know I'm taking your words seriously. Thank you for being direct with me today." I showed the message to Jennifer, who read it with raised eyebrows. "Well, that's surprisingly mature." "Yes," I agreed, feeling a cautious optimism. "It is." "Do you believe him?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. "I want to. But as you pointed out, patterns don't change overnight. Time will tell if this represents a genuine shift or a temporary adjustment." As I gazed out at the darkening sky, I realized that despite the pain of recent events, I felt strangely at peace. The facades were finally falling away, mine, Robert's, all the careful presentations we had maintained for years. What remained was messy, uncomfortable, but real. And perhaps that reality, however challenging, was the necessary foundation for whatever came next. The word burden that had sparked this transformation had lost much of its power to wound me. In its place was a growing clarity about my own worth, my own boundaries, and the legacy I wished to leave, not just financially, but in the values I modeled even in these difficult moments. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I would face them not as the accommodating mother I had been for so long, but as the woman I had finally allowed myself to become. Clear-eyed, strong-willed, and unwilling to compromise my integrity for the sake of false peace. That, I realized, was perhaps the most valuable inheritance I could offer my children. The example of living authentically, even when it was hard, even when it meant facing uncomfortable truths about those we love most. 6 months passed, each day bringing small shifts in my relationship with Robert. There were no dramatic reconciliations, no tearful embraces that magically healed all wounds. Instead, we moved forward in measured steps. Sunday dinners that grew gradually less tense, conversations that ventured beyond safe topics into more meaningful territory, moments of genuine connection amid the lingering awkwardness. The autumn air had turned crisp when I invited the entire family to my beach house at Cannon Beach for the weekend. It would be the first time Robert and his family had visited this private sanctuary, the place that had once symbolized my separate life. The invitation itself represented a new phase in our healing process. I arrived early Friday morning to prepare, walking the shoreline as the tide receded, collecting perfect sand dollars to place on the guest room pillows. The cottage had always been my refuge, but sharing it now felt right, a tangible demonstration of my commitment to living without secrets. Jennifer and Paul arrived first, helping me arrange fresh flowers and prepare a welcome dinner. They had been my steadfast allies throughout the difficult months of readjustment, offering support without judgment as I navigated the complicated terrain with Robert. "Are you nervous about this weekend?" Jennifer asked as we chopped vegetables for a salad. "A little," I admitted. It's one thing to rebuild our relationship in neutral territory. It's another to welcome them into a space that represents how completely I kept them in the dark. Paul looked up from uncorking a bottle of wine. "Or it could be seen as the ultimate gesture of inclusion, bringing them fully into your world." "That's my hope," I agreed, but with Robert I've learned to temper expectations. The crunch of tires on the gravel driveway announced their arrival. Through the window, I watched Robert emerge from his car, his expression a mixture of curiosity and apprehension as he took in the weathered cedar exterior of the cottage, the panoramic ocean view, the carefully tended garden. Vanessa and the children followed, Sophie immediately running toward the beach access path, Zach hanging back with typical teenage reserve. I opened the door before they could knock. "Welcome to my little hideaway." "Grandma!" Sophie rushed, back from the path to hug me. "This is amazing. You can see forever from here." "It is rather special," I agreed, returning her embrace before nodding to Zach, who offered a small wave. "Come in, all of you. Let me show you around." Robert crossed the threshold slowly, his eyes scanning the comfortable living room with its wall of windows facing the Pacific. "So this is where you disappeared to all those times," he said, his tone neutral but not hostile. "One of my favorite places in the world," I confirmed. "I've wanted to share it with you for a long time." The tour proceeded smoothly, everyone expressing appropriate appreciation for the cottage's features: the stone fireplace, the well-appointed kitchen, the private deck off the master bedroom. But it was the small studio space tucked under the eaves that generated the most surprise. "You paint?" Vanessa asked, examining the half-finished seascape on the easel. "I dabble," I replied modestly. "It's something I took up after your father died, Robert. A way to process grief that eventually became a source of joy." Robert picked up a small framed landscape from a nearby shelf. This is really good, Mom. I had no idea you were artistic. There are quite a few things about me you're still discovering, I reminded him gently, just as I'm still learning about you. That evening, gathered around the driftwood dining table with the sunset casting golden light across our faces, the conversation flowed more easily than it had in months. Jennifer shared news about her recent promotion. Paul discussed a community project he was spearheading, and the children contributed animated accounts of school adventures. As dishes were cleared and dessert served, Robert surprised me by raising his glass in a toast. To new beginnings, he said, meeting my gaze directly, and to finally seeing each other clearly. The simple acknowledgement brought a lump to my throat. To clarity, I echoed, raising my own glass. Later, as the younger generation headed to the beach for a moonlit walk, and Jennifer and Paul settled in the living room with a board game, Robert joined me on the deck. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast darkness above. The rhythmic sound of waves providing a soothing backdrop. I understand why you love it here, he said after a comfortable silence. It's peaceful in a way that feels substantial. That's exactly it, I agreed. Not just an absence of noise, but a presence of something deeper. He leaned against the railing, his profile illuminated by the soft glow from the house. I've been thinking a lot about what you said that day at Peninsula Park, about deciding who I want to be. And? I prompted gently when he didn't continue. And I'm not sure I like who I've been, he admitted, his voice lower. Not just with you, but in general. Always reaching for more, never satisfied, measuring success in ways that don't actually matter. It was perhaps the most honest thing he'd ever said to me. Recognition is the first step toward change, I offered, if that's what you want. I do. He turned to face me. But it's hard. 40 years of habits and perspectives don't shift overnight. No, they don't, I agreed. But they can shift gradually, with intention and practice. We stood in companionable silence for a while, listening to the ocean and the distant laughter of his children on the beach below. Mom, he said finally, I'm sorry. Not just for the Pinnacle Trust fiasco, but for everything. For calling you a burden, for dismissing your opinions, for thinking I knew better how you should live your life. I was wrong. The simple apology, delivered without qualifications or excuses, felt like a weightlifting. Thank you, I said softly. That means a great deal to me. There's more, he continued, his voice wavering slightly. I've been meeting with someone, a therapist, trying to understand why I react the way I do, why control is so important to me. This was unexpected. Robert had always dismissed therapy as something for other people, those without his self-discipline and focus. That takes courage, I acknowledged. He shrugged, embarrassed but resolute. Maybe, or maybe it just takes hitting bottom. After that day at the park, Vanessa sat me down for a pretty brutal conversation. Said she was tired of managing my moods, tired of watching me alienate people who care about me. She basically gave me an ultimatum, get help or she'd reevaluate our marriage. I didn't know things had gotten that serious, I said, surprised. Neither did I, he admitted ruefully. That's part of the problem. I wasn't seeing clearly. Too focused on maintaining this image of success, of having everything under control. I nodded, understanding all too well how facades could become prisons. How is it going? The therapy? Hard, he said frankly. Uncomfortable, but useful. I'm starting to see patterns I was blind to before, like how much of my identity was wrapped up in being the responsible one, the son who took charge after Dad died, who looked after his naive mother. The insight was remarkable coming from him, a level of self-awareness I hadn't been sure he was capable of. And when that identity was challenged, I began. I fell apart, he finished. Lashed out, Tried to reassert control any way I could, including exploring ways to challenge my competence, I added, not accusatory but stating facts. Yes, he acknowledged, flushing slightly even in the dim light. Not my finest moment. We all have those, I assured him. What matters is how we respond afterward. He nodded, then surprised me with a question. Do you think Dad would be disappointed in me? In how I've handled things? The vulnerability in his voice transported me back to his childhood. The little boy seeking reassurance after a failed test or lost game. No, I said firmly. Your father would recognize, as I do, that you're doing the hardest work there is, examining yourself honestly and choosing to grow. He'd be proud of that. Robert's eyes glistened, and he turned back toward the ocean, collecting himself. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier. I've been thinking about the conditions in your estate plan. My guard instinctively rose. Robert, no, hear me out, he interrupted gently. I've been thinking about them and they're right. Money without principle is just fuel for emptiness. I've seen it in colleagues, in clients, people with everything except purpose, except connection. I don't want that for myself, and I certainly don't want it for Zach and Sophie. The admission left me momentarily speechless. After all our conflicts over the estate conditions, this reversal seemed almost too good to be true. What changed? I asked finally. He considered the question. Perspective, maybe, or priorities. When Vanessa issued that ultimatum, I realized what actually mattered to me, and it wasn't money or status or being right. It was the people I love, the relationships I'd been taking for granted. From below, we heard laughter as the children raced up the beach steps, their expedition concluded. The moment of private connection was ending, but something significant had shifted between us. We should rejoin the others, I suggested, moving toward the door. Robert reached out, briefly touching my arm. Mom? Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave you every reason to. The months that followed brought continued healing, not without occasional setbacks, but with steady progress toward a more authentic relationship. Robert continued his therapy, gradually becoming more comfortable with vulnerability, more conscious of his tendencies toward control and judgment. I worked on my own patterns too, learning to express my needs directly rather than accommodating, to keep peace. By spring, we had established a new tradition, monthly family dinners that rotated between our homes, including the beach cottage, which had become Sophie's favorite venue. These gatherings were different from the stilted, performance-oriented occasions of the past. They were relaxed, sometimes messy, always genuine. It was during one such dinner at my condo that Robert shared his latest news. I'm making a professional change, he announced as we lingered over dessert. Scaling back my corporate clients to focus on nonprofit work. That's a significant shift, I observed. What prompted it? He glanced at Vanessa, who nodded encouragingly. I've been volunteering with a youth mentorship program, kids from underserved communities interested in business careers. It's been the most rewarding work I've done in years. It suits you, I told him, noticing how his face lit up as he described the program. You've always been an excellent mentor when you believe in what you're doing. The pay cut will be substantial, he acknowledged, but we've discussed it as a family and we're making adjustments, downsizing the house for one thing. Jennifer raised her eyebrows. The West Hills mansion? Really? Vanessa laughed. It's too much house for what actually matters to us now. We're looking at places in Eastmoreland. Good schools, walkable neighborhood, less focus on impressing others. What brought this on? Paul asked, curious. It's quite a lifestyle change. Robert met my gaze across the table. Let's just say I've been reevaluating what success really means, and it's not the things I used to chase so desperately. Later, as the evening wound down and folks prepared to leave, Robert hung back, waiting until we had a moment alone. "There's something else I wanted to tell you," he said, uncharacteristically hesitant. "I've established a scholarship fund for first-generation college students. It's modest for now, but I'm committed to growing it." "That's wonderful," I said sincerely. "What inspired this particular cause?" He smiled slightly. "Remembering how you and Dad started, young, ambitious, without advantages, how you built something through hard work and determination, I want to support others on that journey." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched me deeply. It wasn't just the scholarship itself, but the recognition of values I had tried to instill, the importance of opportunity, of removing barriers for those with potential. "Your father would be so proud," I told him, my voice thick with emotion. "As am I." "I've named it after you," he added quietly. "The Eleanor Wilson First Generation Scholarship Fund, because it's your example that inspired it. Your resilience, your integrity, the way you've lived your values, not just talked about them." I blinked back tears, deeply moved by this tangible acknowledgement of our journey together. "Thank you," I managed. "That means more than I can express." As everyone finally departed, with hugs and promises to gather again soon, I stood at my window watching the city lights shimmer against the darkening sky. The word burden that had once wounded me so deeply now seemed like a relic from another lifetime, a misunderstanding that had, paradoxically, cleared the way for something more authentic to emerge. My phone chimed with a text from Howard Campbell, the retired professor I'd met at the community center months earlier. Our friendship had deepened gradually, evolving into something that brought unexpected joy to my life. "Lecture series confirmed for fall semester. Dinner tomorrow to celebrate?" I smiled, typing back an acceptance. This, too, was part of my transformation, allowing new connections, new experiences, without fear of judgment or concern about appearances. At 65, I had finally stopped living according to others' expectations, my sons, society's, even my late husband's. The fortune that had once been my secret was now simply one aspect of a multifaceted life, neither hidden nor flaunted, but integrated into the whole of who I was. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught sight of my reflection in the bathroom, mirror, silver hair, laugh lines, eyes clear and direct. Not young anymore, certainly, but vital in a way that transcended age. I looked like a woman who had weathered storms and emerged stronger, who had faced difficult truths and chosen growth over comfort. I thought of Robert's words about the scholarship fund, your resilience, your integrity, the way you've lived your values. Perhaps that was the true fortune I possessed, not the millions in my accounts, but the hard-won wisdom that came from living authentically, from standing firm in my own truth even when it would have been easier to yield. The journey hadn't been easy. The word burden had cut deeply, exposing vulnerabilities I hadn't known existed. But that wound, painful as it was, had ultimately been the doorway to liberation. For me, for Robert, for our entire family dynamic. Now, as spring blossoms adorned Portland's trees and gardens, my life felt newly expansive, filled with possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to imagine before. The secret fortune was secret no longer, but the real treasure had turned out to be something different altogether. The freedom to live without pretense, to love without conditions, to age without apology. Robert had called me a burden at Thanksgiving, not knowing about my secret fortune. But the real fortune, I now understood, was never about the money at all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.